One winter night, a long-distance phone call came in to a man. "This is Sheriff Hosey from Virginia. Got any room for another boy, like immediately?" The man said, "Well, where is he now?" To which the sheriff said, "In jail. He's a desperate character. He robbed a bank and held up 3 stores with a revolver." The man asked, "How old is he?" 8.5. "He's what?" "Don't let his age fool you. Can you take him?" You know, if I can't handle an 8.5-year-old, I should quit. Go ahead and bring him out. So 3 days later, the sheriff showed up with this little boy, cigarette hanging out of his mouth. The sheriff said, "You know, I apologize for the cigarette. We had to bribe him with something to make him behave on the way out here. So, you know, don't pay any attention to that." He handed over the boy's record and left. And as the man leafed through the pages of his record, he saw that he'd been shunted around from one foster home to the next from virtually the time that he was several years old, never staying very long at any one place because of his behavior. And he'd finally left the system at age 8 and become the leader of a gang of boys, some of them nearly twice his age. You know, as he read that report, the man thought to himself, you know, that boy certainly isn't a hardened criminal. He's simply a victim. You know, if he'd been born in another home with a loving mother and a devoted father, someone who could give him wise counsel, he wouldn't have turned out this way. The man thought, you know, no matter how bad he is, I will win him over. He told Eddie, that was the boy's name, "I love you, and someday I hope you will understand that because I know you're a good boy." To which Eddie snorted and uttered some 4-letter word, which I won't mention. And true to that behavior, he continued to be disruptive in class. He did everything he could to alienate himself from the teachers, the other boys. Where he had been with a gang of boys as their leader, he distanced himself from all of the other boys in the home. He didn't warm up to any of them. And he was always looking for a place to escape, which he did several times, only to be brought back to the home. Nonetheless, the man didn't give up on him. He smothered him with love, even though it wasn't reciprocated in any way, shape, or form. And as a matter of fact, the other boys started taking bets that the man wouldn't be able to win him over when they saw how disruptive he was and how much he hated being there and hated the man too. Well, at some point, the man began to think that maybe this was hopeless. Maybe there was nothing he could do. Maybe this boy was incorrigible and he couldn't be changed. So he was surprised one night when the boy appeared at the door of his room and said, "Okay, I want to have it out with you. You are a phony." You better prove that, Eddie, or shut up. He said, okay, I just kicked a teacher in the shins. Now tell me what kind of a boy I am. Do you still say I'm a good boy? That is a lie. And you know it can't be true. Doesn't that prove you're a phony? The man asked him a question. What is a good boy? He's obedient. He does what his teachers tell him to do, right? Which Eddie said, yeah. Well, that's all that you've ever done, except you had the wrong teachers. You had the wharf rats, you had the street bums, you had all of these people who taught you by example as well as taught you personally every rotten thing that you've ever done. And you've obeyed them. If you could only use the same approach and method of thinking to the good teachers teaching you good things here in the same way, you'd be just fine. You know, he thought about that at first. It didn't register. And then as he suddenly realized the truth of what the man had told him, he crept around the desk, hopped in the man's lap, put his head against his heart, and broke down, sobbing. Well, the man couldn't contain himself either, as literally the years that he'd hoped the time would come that this would happen caused him to have tears roll down his face as well. Well, for 10 more years, Eddie remained there, finally leaving near the top of his class to join the U.S. Marines. And on blood-drenched beaches of islands that some of you who are older would recognize more, I mean, you would recognize them as being in the news all the time, like Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and all of the islands in the South Pacific. He earned numerous medals, which he wore on his chest. He was a brother to everyone in his outfit. They all respected him. He was an upstanding Christian. And yet, he was the toughest kid that this man had ever known. Unlike Cain, whose answer to God in Genesis 4:9, when asked where his brother Abel was, said, "I know not. Am I my brother's keeper?" This man, Eddie, proved to be just exactly that. He was his brother's keeper. Well, we'll come back to this a little later. Turn to Matthew 5, verse 43. Matthew 5, verse 43. You've heard that it hath been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. And if you were to go to Leviticus 19, verse 18, which you don't have to turn to, I'll just read it, where it says, thou shalt not avenge nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. I am the Lord. Continuing on in Matthew 5, verse 44. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. You might say, why? Well, that's answered in the next verse. The reason you do it is that you may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust. If you were to go anywhere in the United States where there were two farms side by side, and one man was deemed to be good and the other man was deemed to be evil or bad, it wouldn't make any difference. God wouldn't send a big sheet of rain down on the good man's property and leave the bad man's property untouched. He doesn't work that way. He sends rain to everyone, the good and the bad, because unlike us, he can look far beyond in the future and see the potential of the people that we may consider to be evil. And in fact, they may be evil, but he's looking way beyond that. And he's treating everyone fairly. Matthew 5, verse 46. For if you love them which love you, what reward have you? Do not even the publicans the same? If you walk down the street and say hello to someone and they'll say hello back, they've reciprocated. And that's all you can expect. They haven't gone, beyond that. You haven't gone beyond that. If your wife is cool to you for whatever reason, and you go up to maybe hug her and try to, reconcile whatever is causing this coolness, and she pulls back when you try to hug her, maybe she needs some space, because of something that's just happened in her life. Maybe she's found out something about her family or her friends or something that causes her to want to be by herself for a while. You don't get on her case about something like that. You give her space. Matthew 5, verse 47. If you salute your brethren only, what do you more than others? Do not even the publicans do the same thing? Be you, verse 48, therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. So that's what we're striving to do. We're striving to become perfect. We don't do it perfectly. We make mistakes. And if we're honest about it, we're not adverse to admitting it to some of our friends or people close to us. It doesn't mean you roll out a whole laundry list of what you've done this past week. But it's the type of thing that you're willing to share with people who are close to you. Romans 12, verse 18. Continuing on in this vein, Romans 12, verse 18. If, it's a big if it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Not just your friends, not just the people that reciprocate back to you in the same way, with all men. With the men who maybe when you're walking along and you say hello, they turn up their nose or say, oh, what's good about the day or whatever. Doesn't make any difference how they treat you. It says, live peaceably with all men. Verse 19, dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. For it's written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. And that's true. God will repay in his own way, in his own time, in his own manner. If it's warranted, he will do it. But that's up to him. That's not up to us. And this is probably one of the most difficult things for us to do, is to pull back and not want to avenge something or to get back at someone who we feel has done something bad to us. Romans 12, verse 20. Therefore, if thy enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. The commentaries generally acknowledge this is not a literal translation. Excuse me. In that doing something like that would be extremely painful physically. If you just imagine what it would be like if someone took a pot of hot coals and dumped them on your head. Physically, that would be very painful. But I think here it may go beyond that, and it may be addressing the emotional pain that we can cause other people for what we say, what we accuse them of, what we tell them or instruct them about the way something should be. The emotional pain that comes from hearing that kind of abuse can be probably worse in the long run than the physical pain of having something like coals on your head. It does imply that just like Eddie, when you repay your enemy with goodness, and it happened to him, it burns his conscience at some point, at some time. That registers and has an impact on the other person because he can't understand why you're doing it. What's your motivation? And it may produce emotional pangs, perhaps leading to his remorse about how he's treated you. But going back to that, whatever the exact meaning is, we need to pay attention to what Paul said here. And he was quoting, by the way, from Proverbs 25, verse 21. Proverbs 25, verse 21, where it says, if thy enemy be hungry, give him bread to eat, and if he be thirsty, give him water to drink, for thou shalt heap coals of fire upon his head, and the Eternal shall reward you. So God is going to be the one to reward you for this kind of action, this kind of treatment that you do toward other people that you may consider to be in the category of an enemy. He will repay you for the kindness that you've shown to that enemy. Romans 12:21. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. Do just the opposite of what they expect you to do. There's another well-known example of this in action. Turn to 1 Samuel 24. 1 Samuel 24. And it's the example, some of this I'll read and some I'll just paraphrase. When Saul, thinking that David was trying to usurp him and take over the throne, took out to kill him. Verse 1 of 1 Samuel 24. And it came to pass when Saul was returned from following the Philistines that it was told him, saying, Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men upon the rocks of the wild goats. And he came to the sheepcotes. And I had to look that up because right off the top of my head, I had no idea what a sheepcote was, but it was a pen where they kept the sheep. By the way, where was a cave, and Saul went in to cover his feet or go to the bathroom. I'm not sure where they got that expression, but that's what it means. And David and his men remained in the sides of the cave. So if you think about this, that there's a little bit of humor involved. All of these men were lined up in the back of the cave, and Saul came in and probably sat down or crouched down and looked out toward the front of the cave where the light came from. I mean, that would be the normal thing that you do, trying to protect yourself from being seen. You'd be the first to see someone coming in. And the men of David said unto him, Behold, the day of which the Lord said unto thee, Behold, I will deliver thy enemy into thy hand, that thou mayest do to him as it shall seem good unto thee. So they said, here's your chance. You know, Saul's been seeking to take your life. He won't stand a chance with all of us in here. Then David arose and cut off the skirt of Saul's robe privately or secretly, and that in itself would be somewhat of a feat, although if he was the king, he'd probably have a fairly long robe, and David could have, stolen up there and cut off a piece of it. And it came to pass afterwards, verse 5, that David's heart smote him because he had cut off Saul's skirt. And it bothered him. In verse 6, he said unto his men, The Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch forth my hand against him, seeing he's the anointed of the Lord. David wasn't going to mess with anything that it was God's place or position to do. Verse 7, So David stayed his servants with these words and suffered them not to rise against Saul. But Saul rose up out of the cave and went on his way. And then verse 8, David also arose afterward and went out of the cave and cried after Saul, saying, My lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed himself, paid honor to the king. And David said to Saul, Wherefore hearest thou men's words, saying, Behold, David seeketh thy hurt? So why have you listened to the people that are telling you, in spite of the fact the women have sung about Saul killing his thousands and David his 10,000s, in spite of all of the backdrop to all of this, and the reason why Saul was after David. It's not true. Behold, this day thine eyes have seen, this is verse 10, how that the Lord hath delivered thee today into my hand in the cave, and some bade me kill thee, but my eye spared thee. And I said, I will not put forth my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Verse 11, moreover, my father, see, yea, check out your robe, and then look at this piece of cloth that I'm holding in my hand, and see if it doesn't match what's missing in your robe. For in that I cut off the skirt of thy robe and killed thee not. Know thou and see that there is neither evil nor transgression in my hand. And I've not sinned against thee, yet thou huntest my soul to take it. So David was trying to prove to Saul, I had the chance to kill you. You were there right in front of me. It would have been very easy for me to have dispatched you with one slice of my sword, and your men, until maybe a while later, wouldn't even realize that something had happened to you. But I didn't. And know thou and see that there is neither evil nor transgression in my hand, and I have not sinned against thee, yet thou huntest my soul to take it. Verse 12, the Lord judged between me and thee, and the Lord avenged me of thee, but my hand shall not be upon thee. And here again it goes back to the verse I read where we are told, vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Eternal. You don't have to worry about people being paid back or being punished for what they do to you or have done to you or will do to you. That's not even part of your consideration of them. God will take care of them. And that's the thing you need to remember. Verse 13, as saith the proverb of the ancients, wickedness proceedeth from the wicked, but my hand shall not be upon thee. Once again reiterating that it wasn't up to David to deal with Saul. After whom is the king of Israel come out? After whom dost thou pursue? After a dead dog, after a flea. And David was saying that, is all I am in your eyes. I don't amount to anything. Anything that is worthwhile about me comes from God. But in and of myself, I'm no better off than a dead dog or a flea. Verse 15, the Lord therefore be judge, and judge between me and thee, and see and plead my cause, and deliver me out of thy hand. I'm going to rely on God. I don't have to worry about what you plan to do. Verse 16, and it came to pass when David had made an end of speaking these words unto Saul, that Saul said, is this thy voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice, and he wept. And he said to David, thou art more righteous than I, for thou hast rewarded me good, whereas I've rewarded thee evil. So here again we see this principle in motion. Verse 18, and thou hast showed this day how thou hast dealt well with me, for as much as when the Lord had delivered me into thy hand, thou killest me not. For if a man find his enemy, will he let him go well away? Wherefore, the Eternal reward thee good for that thou hast done unto me this day. You know, every so often you'll hear in the news or read a news report about a rogue policeman or a vigilante who has taken upon himself to exact justice when maybe to his way of thinking the courts have failed to do their job, at least according to his perception. They go out because of their background in tracing people and so forth. They find where these people live and they execute them. Someone who perhaps has gotten off scot-free because of some legal technicality or because of a sharp attorney who's discovered a case or some loophole that allows the criminal he is defending to go free. Perhaps another thing you may have heard about are honor killings, which happen in certain countries, such as the Middle East or India, where someone in the family brings dishonor to the family by something they've done, something perhaps they haven't done, or even had done to them, which, because of what it is, dishonors the family and the family's reputation. And the law looks the other way while the family exacts their so-called justice. To us, that's bizarre. I mean, you know, living in the United States and knowing how the law works, that is very abhorrent to them. But when you are reared in a certain society where that is the way things are done, you know, it seems like it's a normal thing. It's not anything out of the ordinary. I remember the example of this type of thing in a movie I saw a few years back where a teenager, a young girl, had fallen in love with a member of a young boy of a different caste or different sect. I don't remember exactly the distinction between them, much to the chagrin of the family and the parents. And they wouldn't have anything to do with the person and forbid their daughter to see him any longer. But, as often happens, teenage love at a point like that was so great that they decided they'd run away, which they did. They moved clear away to another part of the country so they could be husband and wife. And they were married, and like I said, the family would not talk to them, wouldn't see them, wouldn't have anything to do with them. And a year or so later, they had a little baby. And they were so excited about having this child and wanting the parents to see their grandchild that they sent an invitation as a way of making amends. You know, we'd like you to come and see your grandchild. We'd like you to come over for dinner. And they were very surprised when the family accepted. And I think in this case it was particularly the father that had been very adamant with his daughter about not marrying. But in any event, the father and her brother, along with some other family members, I forget just exactly the nature of their relationship, came. And they were very excited about the fact that they were coming to visit. They lived in a very modest home, but it was spick and span. They went out and bought food they couldn't normally afford just to honor them for this visit. So the father and the brother came and the other family members, and they all sat down to have a wonderful meal together. And then the screen went black for an instant, and the next thing you heard was a baby crying. And the camera showed their baby sitting out at the front of the house, crying all by himself, no one else around. And then the camera panned in through the door and into the room, and there was the husband and wife lying in a pool of blood. And that was how the film ended. I mean, it was the type of thing that leaves a lasting impression, and I'm sure it was designed, because it was a foreign film, to illustrate what can happen when you go against your family in that society, as it were. The family had exacted their vengeance and finally restored honor to the family because of what their daughter had done. And if that isn't the most warped thing, I mean, from our standpoint, looking at it, you just shake your head. Anyway, it's a very bizarre example of showing love, that's for sure. And I thought it was a terrible way to end the movie, but it was very, very real and it left an impression. And I'm sure it was designed, as I said, especially for the culture it would be shown in, to leave that kind of impression of what it would be like to dishonor your family. Well, as I mentioned, that culture exists in other countries as well. And apparently, that is still sanctioned by the authorities. We're fortunate that we live in a country where those practices are not followed. Or do they? Or are they? Maybe not as dramatically and as physically as what I just told you was portrayed. But what about the emotional turmoil in families where someone is shunned when they do something or neglected? That can be equally as devastating. God tells us to love our enemies, and that can be a very big order unless we're close to Him and relying on His Holy Spirit to guide us and help us do that. Yes, loving our enemies can make a difference, and it does work. It did in the case of Eddie, the boy I mentioned at the beginning, and the lives of countless other unfortunate boys that this man helped during his life. Many who, like Eddie, were his enemies at first, but later on were won over because of his love and for his concern for them. He was one of 11 children himself. He was reared in a home where they had very few material possessions, but it was a home filled with warmth and love from both parents. And as a result of that role model that he saw as a boy growing up in that home, he expressed this love to his friends and his enemies as well. This took place in a small town 10 miles west of Omaha, Nebraska. Its founder, Edward Joseph Flanagan, whose unselfish love for Eddie, his enemy at first, but later his friend, and countless other unfortunate boys during his life is epitomized by Boytown's famous slogan of love and brotherhood, which pictures a young boy carrying an even younger boy on his back with a caption underneath, "He ain't heavy, Father, he's my brother."